Jai Hind, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me a great pleasure to extend a very warm welcome to each one of you for joining me to watch this video presentation on global reporting format for runway surface conditions. The objective of the new global reporting format for runway surface conditions is to reduce the risk of runway excursions. In order to ensure that you receive the complete information on global reporting format, we are releasing two videos simultaneously on this subject. I am sure that you'll find the video presentation interesting. The global reporting format is a global methodology for assessing and reporting runway surface conditions. The GRF is applicable globally from 4th November 21. GRF has been developed by the International Civil Aviation Organization to help mitigate the risk of runway excursions. Accidents related to runway excursions accounted for 25% of all accidents during 2015 to 19, which resulted in the second highest percentage of fatal accidents, that is 11% and 55 deaths. The runway excursion accident category represented 32% of all accidents in 2019 and included 2 fatal accidents with 3 fatalities. Now we'll have a look at the DGCA CAR and circulars on global reporting format. Operational Circular OC number 1 of 2021, the new global reporting format for runway surface conditions and issuance of snow time, dated 30th September 21. Then there is Aerodrome Advisory Circular ADAC number 1 of 2021. Now we shall have a look at the philosophy of GRF. The philosophy of the GRF is that the airport operator assesses the runway surface conditions when air, water or sand is present on an operational runway. From this assessment, a runway condition code and a description of the runway surface are reported to aid the pilots to calculate operational performance. GRF format, which is based on the type, depth and coverage of contaminants, is the best assessment of the runway surface condition by the airport operator. When changes in conditions occur, they should be reported to the pilots without delay. Now, what is a contaminant? A deposit such as snow, slush, ice, standing water, mud, dust, sand, oil, and rubber on an aerodrome pavement, the effect of which is detrimental to the friction characteristics of the pavement surface. What is a contaminated runway? A runway is contaminated when a significant portion of the runway surface area, whether in isolated areas or not, within the length and width being used, is covered by one or more of these substances listed in the runway surface condition descriptors. Now we shall discuss runway condition assessment matrix, RCAM for short. RCAM is a matrix for the assessment of the runway condition code using associated procedures from a set of observed runway surface conditions and a report by the pilot of the braking action. RCAM is used by operators to assess runway surface conditions. RCAM identifies factors that influence aircraft's takeoff and landing performance, particularly braking performance. RCAM relates these factors to runway condition code that can be used by flight crew to interpret the runway conditions and support their pre-landing and pre-departure assessment of runway condition code. Now, what is runway condition code? Runway condition code is a number describing the runway surface condition to be used in the runway condition report. This code is associated with the relevant runway surface description, and it is based on the type of contaminant on the runway, its depth, and the outside air temperature. Now we shall talk about runway condition report. The runway condition report relates to runway surface conditions and its effect on the airplane landing and takeoff performance. The concept of the RCR is premised on an agreed set of criteria used in a consistent manner for runway surface condition assessment, airplane performance certification, and operational performance calculation. A unique runway condition code linking this set of criteria with the aircraft landing and takeoff performance table and related to the braking action experienced and eventually reported by flight crews. Reporting of contaminant type and depth that is relevant to takeoff performance. Runway surface conditions. It is a description of the condition of the runway surface used in the runway condition report, which establishes the basis for the determination of the runway condition code for aeroplane performance purposes. Now the definition of SNOTAM. A special series NOTAM given in a standard format providing a runway surface condition report notifying the presence or cessation of hazardous conditions due to snow, ice, slush, frost, standing water, or water associated with snow, slush, ice, or frost on the movement area. Now, slippery wet runway. What is a slippery wet runway? A slippery wet runway is a wet runway where the surface friction characteristics of a significant portion of the runway have been degraded. The surface friction characteristics of a runway or a portion thereof can be degraded due to rubber deposits, surface polishing, poor drainage, or other factors. Now we shall have a look at the methods of determination. First one is functional friction measurements using continuous friction measuring devices that fall below a minimum standard as defined by the state. Observations by aerodrome maintenance personnel. Repeated reports by pilots and aircraft operators based on flight crew experience and through analysis of airplane's topping performance that indicates a substandard surface. Now, what is a wet runway? A runway surface is called wet when the runway surface is covered by any visible dampness or water up to and including 3 millimeter deep within the intended area of use. Now we shall have a look at the roles of various agencies. First of all, airport operators. The airport operators are to assess the runway conditions and report them by means of a uniform runway condition report. ATC, the role of ATC is to convey information from runway condition report to aircraft operators. The runway condition report may be conveyed in the form of a SNOTAM or ATIS or by the ATC. Pilots, the runway condition report consists of two sections: airplane takeoff and landing performance calculations, situational awareness of the surface conditions on the runway, taxiways, and aprons. Now we shall have a look at the GRF concept. Now there are 5 fundamental elements in GRF. First one is runway condition report. Second is runway condition assessment matrix, RCAM. Runway condition code, RWYCC. Runway surface conditions and runway surface condition descriptors. The runway surface conditions describe the runway surface conditions used in the runway condition report, which establishes the basis for the determination of the runway condition code for aircraft performance purposes. There are 4 runway surface conditions under RCAM: dry runway, wet runway, slippery wet, and contaminated runway. Contaminated runway surface conditions, we have 8 contaminated runway surface conditions. It may be compacted snow, dry snow, frost, ice, slush, standing water, wet ice, and wet snow. The runway surface description shall be assessed and reported through a runway condition code and a description of using the following terms: compacted snow, dry, dry snow on top of compacted snow, dry snow on top of ice, frost, ice, slush, standing water, water on top of compacted snow, wet, wet ice, wet snow on top of compacted snow, wet snow on top of ice chemically treated, and loose sand. Now, runway condition code. A runway condition code is a number that describes the runway surface conditions to be used in the runway condition report. RCAM allows the assessment of the runway condition code. The RCAM supports the classification of runway surface conditions according to their effect on aircraft braking performance. The purpose of the runway condition code is to permit an operational aircraft performance calculation by the flight crew. From this assessment, a one-digit runway condition code and a description of the runway surface are reported, which can be used by the flight crew for aircraft performance calculations. It has been established that it is appropriate to assume the Tier 2 ground wheel braking coefficient associated with runway condition code in the performance calculation for a runway failing to provide the minimum friction level specified by the state. Slippery wet runway conditions are thus associated with runway condition code in the runway condition report whenever such a runway surface is affected by any visible moisture. Now, shall I look at the depth of loose contaminants. The depth of loose contaminants in each third of the runway is reported in millimeters with a 2 or 3-digit number. For example, a report of 04/04/05 indicates that the first two-thirds of the runway has contamination depth of 4 millimeters, whereas the final third of the runway has a depth of 5 millimeters. Depth of loose contaminants are only reported for dry snow, wet snow, slush, or standing water for each runway third. Any fluid contaminant below 3 millimeters is considered wet. A well-constructed and maintained pavement allows tires to drain fluid from footprint and maintain contact with the runway, and therefore there is no threat of dynamic aquaplaning. Any fluid contaminant above 3 millimeters is considered contaminated, and aquaplaning occurs above the aquaplaning speed on such runway. Now we shall discuss effect of the contaminant. Different contaminants affect the contact area between the tire and runway surface, where the stopping force is generated in different ways. A water film of any depth leads to the partial separation, that is viscous aquaplaning, or total separation dynamic aquaplaning of the tire from the surface. Hard contaminants such as ice or compacted snow prevent contact between the tire and runway surface completely and at any speed, effectively providing a new surface that the tire rolls on. For other reportable contaminants like oil, mud, ash, etc., there is a large variance in the airplane performance effect, or insufficient data are available to permit a deterministic classification. An exception is rubber contamination, for which in-service data indicate that an assumption of runway condition code, that is slippery wet, restores usual performance margins. When single or multiple contaminants are present, the runway condition code for any third of the runway is determined using the following rules. When the runway third contains a single contaminant, the runway condition code for the third is directly based on that contaminant in the RCAM as follows. If the contaminant coverage for the third is less than 10%, a runway condition code of 6 is to be generated for that third and no contaminant is to be reported. If all thirds have less than 10% contaminant coverage, no report is generated. If the percent contaminant coverage for the third is greater than or equal to 10% and less than or equal to 25%, a runway condition code of 6 is to be generated for the third and the contaminant reported at 25% coverage. If the percent contaminant coverage for the third is greater than 25%, the runway condition code for the third shall be based on the contaminant present. If multiple contaminants are present, where the total coverage is more than 25%, but no single contaminant covers more than 25% of any runway third. In this case, the runway condition code will be based upon the judgment by the trained personnel, considering what contaminant will most likely be encountered by the airplane and its likely effect on the airplane's performance. Now we shall discuss pilot report of runway braking action. Pilot reports of runway braking action via AREPs will typically provide the aerodrome personnel and other pilots with an observation that can confirm the ground-based assessment or alert of degraded conditions experienced in terms of braking capability and oblique or lateral control during landing roll. Pilots will use the term good, good to medium, medium, medium to poor, poor and less than poor. When receiving an AREP, the recipient should consider that these terms rarely apply to the full length of the runway and are limited to the specific sections of the runway surface in which sufficient wheel braking is applied. Since AREPs are subjective and contaminated runway may affect the performance of different airplane types in different ways, the reported braking actions may not be directly transferable to another aeroplane. If air traffic service units receive an AREP by voice communication concerning braking action that is found not to be as good as that reported, they will forward the AREP without delay to the appropriate aerodrome operator. This is a prerequisite for using the AREP for downgrading purposes when assessing the runway condition code. AREPs may be generated by automated systems processing airplane data recorded during the deceleration phase. Such reports are deemed to be less subjective than those generated based on the flight crew's perception alone and may provide additional information. It is therefore encouraged to discriminate between the two types of report origins. Now we shall have a look at the dissemination of runway condition report. The outcome of the evaluation and associated runway condition code, which is used to complete runway condition report, is forwarded to air traffic services and the aeronautical information services for dissemination to pilots through the aeronautical information service using a SNOTAM and to ATS through ATIS and or VICE when the runway is wholly or partly contaminated by standing water, snow, slush, ice, frost, or is wet associated with the clearing or treatment of snow, slush, ice, or frost. Now we shall talk about the training aspects. The pilots and flight dispatchers of operators need to undergo a course covering the following topics: operations on wet oblique contaminated runways, effect of contamination on performance calculation during takeoff and landing, RCAM and runway condition code, runway condition report, SNOTAM, feedback to be given to ATC in case the actual conditions does not match the reported conditions through AREPs. Now we shall talk about recommendations to aerodrome operators. Aerodrome operators should ensure that the procedures to assess runway surface conditions according to ICAO global reporting format include reactive as well as proactive surface assessment to make sure hazardous changes are all identified and communicated in a timely manner. They should ensure robust procedures are in place for communicating information regarding changing surface conditions as frequently as practicable to the appropriate services according to the ICAO global reporting format. Roles, responsibilities of stakeholders, and coordination procedures should be formalized. Runway condition codes assessed should be compared against braking action report by the pilots to ensure the accuracy of the information provided to the pilots. Ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, first of all, the aircraft operators should consider and be aware of the runway surface condition reporting methodology at the airports to which they operate. Special consideration should be given to those aerodromes that are critical in terms of runway length, challenging weather conditions, aerodrome capability, reliability for runway surface conditions, assessment and reporting. Country consideration should be given in particular to the runway surface condition reporting format and terminology in use. Operators should base their assessment on information contained in the AIP, in-service experience, safety occurrence reporting. Aircraft operators should include in their flight crew training program at least the following elements: description of runway surface condition reporting methods, types of runway contamination and its effect, aeroplane takeoff and landing performance on wet and contaminated runways. When substantial differences are identified at a particular aerodrome or in a particular state or region in relation to runway surface condition assessment and reporting, the operator should ensure that flight crews are properly informed on the type and format of runway surface condition reports they will get at these locations. In case of uncertainty on runway surface condition reporting, conservative assumptions should be made either in terms of airplane performance calculations or when different conditions are reported for different segments of the runway in terms of assuming the worst condition for the entire runway. Flight crews should report the runway braking action encountered when it is not as good as expected according to the values previously reported to them. Flight crew reports should be consistent with the format in use at the aerodrome being operated, as they may be used by the aerodrome operator to downgrade the runway condition. They may be used also by the flight crews for subsequent flights using the same runway. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for making efforts to watch this video presentation on global reporting format for runway surface conditions. Hope you are better informed about global reporting format after watching this video presentation. All the operators and pilots are requested to watch both the video presentations which have been uploaded on YouTube by Aviation Safety India on global reporting format for understanding of the practical aspects of global reporting format. Wishing you all a very happy, safe and enjoyable flying and many happy landings. Jai Hind.